Chapter 2 of the Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women, by Edward Carpenter. Chapter 2 The Intermediate Sex. Earning men and women, on whose book of life nature has written her new word, which sounds so strange to us, bear such storm and stress within them, such ferment and fluctuation, so much complex material having its outlet only towards the future. Their individualities are so rich and many-sided, and withal so little understood, that it is impossible to characterize them adequately in a few sentences. Auto de jus. In late years, and since the arrival of the new woman amongst us, many things in the relation of men and women to each other have altered, or at any rate become clearer. The growing sense of equality in habits and customs, university studies, art, music, politics, the bicycle, etc., all these things have brought about a rapprochement between the sexes. If the modern woman is a little more masculine in some ways than her predecessor, the modern man, it is to be hoped, while by no means effeminate, is a little more sensitive in temperament and artistic in feeling than the original John Bull. It is beginning to be recognized that the sexes do not or should not normally form two groups hopelessly isolated in habit and feeling from each other, but that they rather represent the two poles of one group, which is the human race. So that while certainly the extreme specimens at either pole are vastly divergent, there are great numbers in the middle region who, though differing corporeally as men and women, are by emotion and temperament very near to each other. We all know women with a strong dash of the masculine temperament, and we all know men whose almost feminine sensibility and intuition seem to belie their bodily form. Nature, it might appear, in mixing the elements which go to compose each individual, does not always keep her two groups of ingredients, which represent the two sexes, properly apart, but often throws them crosswise in a somewhat baffling manner, now this way and now that. Yet wisely we must think, for if a severe distinction of elements were always maintained, the two sexes would soon drift into far latitudes and absolutely cease to understand each other. As it is, there are some remarkable and, we think, indispensable types of character in whom there is such a union or balance of the feminine and masculine qualities that these people become to a great extent the interpreters of men and women to each other. There is another point which has almost become clearer of late. For as people are beginning to see that the sexes form in a certain sense a continuous group, so they are beginning to see that love and friendship, which have been so often set apart from each other as things distinct, are in reality closely related and shade imperceptibly into one another. Women are beginning to demand that marriage shall mean friendship as well as passion, that a comrade-like equality shall be included in the word love, and it is recognized that from the one extreme of platonic friendship, generally between persons of the same sex, up to the other extreme of passionate love, generally between persons of opposite sex, No hard and fast line can at any point be drawn effectively separating the different kinds of attachment. We know, in fact, of friendships so romantic in sentiment that they verge into love. We know of love so intellectual and spiritual that they hardly dwell in the sphere of passion. A moment's thought will show that the general conceptions indicated above, if anywhere near the truth, point to an immense diversity of human temperament and character in matters relating to sex and love. But though such diversity has probably always existed, it has only in comparatively recent times become an object of study. More than 30 years ago, however, an Austrian writer, K. H. Ulrichs, drew attention in a series of pamphlets, Memnon, Arispe, Inclusa, etc., to the existence of a class of people who strongly illustrate the above remarks, and with whom specially this paper is concerned. He pointed out that there were people born in such a position, as it were on the dividing line between the sexes, that while belonging distinctly to one sex as far as their bodies are concerned, they may be said to belong mentally and emotionally to the other. That there might be men, for instance, who might be described as of feminine soul enclosed in a male body, anima muliebris in corpore virile inclusa, or in other cases, women whose definition would be just the reverse. And he maintained that this doubleness of nature was to a great extent proved by the special direction of their love sentiment. For in such cases, as indeed might be expected, the apparently masculine person, instead of forming a love union with a female, tended to contract romantic friendships with one of his own sex, while the apparently feminine would, instead of marrying in the usual way, devote herself to the love of another feminine. People of this kind, i.e., having this special variation of the love sentiment, he called Urnings. Footnote: from Uranos, heaven, his idea being that the Uranian love was of a higher order than the ordinary attachment. End footnote. And though we are not obliged to accept his theory about the crosswise connection between body and soul, since at best these words are somewhat vague and indefinite, yet his work was important because it was one of the first attempts in modern times to recognize the existence of what might be called an intermediate sex, and to give at any rate some explanation of it. Footnote: Charles G. Leland, Hans Breitmann, in his book The Alternate Sex, Welby, 1904, insists much on the frequent combination of the characteristics of both sexes in remarkable men and women, and has a chapter on the female mind in man, and another on the male intellect in women. End footnote. Since that time, the subject has been widely studied and written about by scientific men and others, especially on the continent, though in England it is still comparatively unknown, and by means of an extended observation of present-day cases, as well as the indirect testimony of the history and literature of past times, quite a body of general conclusions has been arrived at, of which I propose in the following pages to give some slight account. Contrary to the general impression, one of the first points that emerges from this study is that Urnings or Uranians are by no means so very rare, but that they form, beneath the surface of society, a large class. It remains difficult, however, to get an exact statement of their numbers, and this for more than one reason. Partly because, owing to the want of any general understanding of their case, these folk tend to conceal their true feelings from all but their own kind, and indeed often deliberately act in such a manner as to lead the whole world astray. Whence it arises that a normal man living in a certain society will often refuse to believe that there is a single Urning in the circle of his acquaintances, while one of the latter, or one that understands the nature, living in the same society, can count perhaps a score or more. And partly because it is indubitable that the numbers do vary very greatly, not only in different countries, but even in the different classes in the same country. The consequences of all this being that we have estimates differing very widely from each other. Dr. Grabowski, a well-known writer in Germany, quotes figures which we must think must be exaggerated, as high as 1 man in every 22, while Dr. Albert Moll, De Contrare Sexual Infundum, Chapter 3, gives estimates varying from 1 in every 50 to as low as 1 in every 500. These figures apply to such as are exclusively of the said nature, i.e., to those whose deepest feelings of love and friendship go out only to persons of their own sex. Of course, if in addition are included those double-natured people, of whom there is a great number, who experience the normal attachment with the homogenic tendency in less or greater degrees superadded, the estimates must be greatly higher. In the second place, it emerges, also contrary to the general impression, that men and women of the exclusively Uranian type are by no means necessarily morbid in any way, unless, indeed, their peculiar temperament be pronounced in itself morbid. Formerly, it was assumed as a matter of course that the type was merely a result of disease and degeneration. But now, with the examination of the actual facts, it appears that, on the contrary, many are fine, healthy specimens of their sex, muscular and well developed in body, of powerful brain, high standards of conduct, and with nothing abnormal or morbid of any kind observable in their physical structure or constitution. This is of course not true of all, and there still remain a certain number of cases of weakly type to support the neuropathic view. Yet it is very noticeable that this view is much less insisted on by the later writers than by the earlier. It is also worth noticing that it is now acknowledged that even in the most healthy cases, the special affectional temperament of the intermediate is, as a rule, ineradicable. So much so that when, as in not a few instances, such men and women from social or other considerations have forced themselves to marry and even have children, they have still not been able to overcome their own bias, or the leaning, after all, of their life attachment to some friend of their own sex. This subject, though obviously one of considerable interest and importance, has been hitherto, as I have pointed out, but little discussed in this country, partly owing to a certain amount of doubt and distrust which has, not unnaturally perhaps, surrounded it. And certainly, if the men and women born with the tendency in question were only exceedingly rare, though it would not be fair on that account to ignore them, yet it would hardly be necessary to dwell at great length on their case. But as the class is really on any computation numerous, it becomes a duty for society not only to understand them, but to help them to understand themselves. For there is no doubt that, in many cases, people of this kind suffer a great deal from their own temperament, and yet, after all, it is possible that they may have an important part to play in the evolution of the race. Anyone who realizes what love is, the dedication of the heart, so profound, so absorbing, so mysterious, so imperative, and always just in the noblest natures so strong, cannot fail to see how difficult, how tragic even, must often be the fate of those whose deepest feelings are destined from the earliest days to be a riddle or a stumbling block, unexplained to themselves, passed over in silence by others. To call people of such temperament morbid and so forth is of no use. Such a term is, in fact, absurdly inapplicable to many who are among the most active, the most amiable and accepted members of society. Besides, it forms no solution of the problem in question, and only amounts to marking down for disparagement a fellow creature who has already considerable difficulties to contend with. Says Dr. Moll, quote, "Anyone who has seen many Urnings will probably admit that they form a by no means enervated human group. On the contrary, one finds powerful, healthy-looking folk among them." End quote. But in the next sentence he says that they suffer severely from the way they are regarded. And in the manifesto of a considerable community of such people in Germany occur these words, quote, "The rays of sunshine in the night of our existence are so rare that we are responsive and deeply grateful for the least movement, for every single voice that speaks in our favor in the forum of mankind." End quote. In dealing with this class of folk, then, while I do not deny that they present a difficult problem, I think that just for that very reason their case needs discussion. It would be a great mistake to suppose that their attachments are necessarily sexual, or connected with sexual acts. On the contrary, as abundant evidence shows, they are often purely emotional in their character, and to confuse Uranians, as is often done, with libertines having no law but curiosity and self-indulgence, is to do them a great wrong. At the same time, it is evident that their special temperament may sometimes cause them difficulty in regard to their sexual relations. Into the subject we need not just now enter, but we may point out how hard it is, especially for the young among them, that a veil of complete silence should be drawn over the subject, leading to the most painful misunderstandings and perversions and confusions of mind, and that there should be no hint of guidance, nor any recognition of the solitary and really serious inner struggles that they may have to face. If the problem is a difficult one, as it undoubtedly is, the fate of these people is already hard who have to meet it in their own persons, without their suffering in addition from the refusal of society to give them any help. It is partly for these reasons, and to throw a little light where it may be needed, that I have thought it might be advisable in this paper simply to give a few characteristics of the intermediate types. As indicated then already, in bodily structure there is, as a rule, nothing to distinguish the subjects of our discussion from ordinary men and women. But if we take the general mental characteristics, it appears from almost universal testimony that the male tends to be of a rather gentle, emotional disposition, with defects, if such exist, in the direction of subtlety, evasiveness, timidity, vanity, etc., while the female is just the opposite, fiery, active, bold, and truthful, with defects running to brusqueness and coarseness. Moreover, the mind of the former is generally intuitive and instinctive in its perceptions, with more or less of artistic feeling, while the mind of the latter is more logical, scientific, and precise than usual with the normal woman. So marked indeed are these general characteristics that sometimes, by means of them, though not an infallible guide, the nature of the boy or girl can be detected in childhood, before full development has taken place, and needless to say it may often be very important to be able to do this. It was no doubt in consequence of the observation of these signs that K.H. Ulrichs proposed his theory. And though the theory, as we have said, does not by any means meet all the facts, still it is perhaps not without merit, and may be worth bearing in mind. In the case, for instance, of a woman of this temperament, defined, we suppose, as a male soul in a female body, the theory helps us to understand how it might be possible for her to fall bona fide in love with another woman. Krafft-Ebing gives the case of a lady A, 28 years of age, who fell deeply in love with a younger one, B. I loved her divinely, she said. They lived together, and the union lasted 4 years, but was broken by the marriage of B. A suffered in consequence from frightful depression, but in the end, though without real love, got married herself. Her depression, however, only increased and deepened into illness. The doctors, when consulted, said that all would be well if she would only have a child. The husband, who loved his wife sincerely, could not understand her enigmatic behavior. She was friendly to him, suffered his caresses, but for days afterwards remained dull, exhausted, plagued with irritation of the spine, and nervous. Presently, a journey of the married pair led to another meeting with the female friend, who had now been wedded, but also unhappily, for 3 years. Quote, both ladies trembled with joy and excitement as they fell into each other's arms, and were thenceforth inseparable. The man found that this friendship relation was a singular one, and hastened the departure. When the opportunity occurred, he convinced himself from the correspondence between his wife and her friend that their letters were exactly like those of 2 lovers. End quote. It appears that the loves of such women are often very intense, and, as also in the case of male Urnings, lifelong. Both classes feel themselves blessed when they love happily. Nevertheless, to many of them, it is a painful fact that, in consequence of their peculiar temperament, they are, though fond of children, not in possession to found a family. We have so far limited ourselves to some very general characteristics of the intermediate race. It may help to clear and fix our ideas if we now describe more in detail, first, what may be called the extreme and exaggerated types of the race, and then the more normal and perfect types. By doing so, we shall get a more definite and concrete view of our subject. In the first place, then, the extreme specimens, as in most cases of extremes, are not particularly attractive, sometimes quite the reverse. In the male of this kind we have a distinctly effeminate type, sentimental, lackadaisical, mincing in gait and manners, something of a chatterbox, skillful at the needle and in women's work, sometimes taking pleasure in dressing in woman's clothes, his figure not unfrequently betraying a tendency towards the feminine, large at the hips, supple, not muscular, the face wanting in hair, the voice inclining to be high-pitched, etc., while his dwelling-room is orderly in the extreme, even natty, and choice of decoration and perfume. His affection, too, is often feminine in character, clinging, dependent, and jealous, as of one desiring to be loved almost more than to love. Footnote: a good deal of this description may remind readers of history of the habits and character of Henry III of France. End footnote. On the other hand, as the extreme type of homogenic female, we have a rather markedly aggressive person, of strong passions, masculine manners and movements, practical in the conduct of life, sensuous rather than sentimental in love, often untidy and outre in attire. Footnote: perhaps like Queen Christine of Sweden, who rode across Europe on her visit to Italy in jack-boots and sitting astride of her horse. It is said that she shook the Pope's hand on seeing him so heartily that the doctor had to attend to it afterwards. End footnote. Her figure muscular, her voice rather low in pitch, her dwelling-room decorated with sporting scenes, pistols, etc., and not without a suspicion of the fragrant weed in the atmosphere, while her love, generally to rather soft and feminine specimens of her own sex, is often a sort of furor, similar to the ordinary masculine love, and at times almost uncontrollable. These are types which, on account of their salience, everyone will recognize more or less. Naturally, when they occur, they excite a great deal of attention, and it is not an uncommon impression that most persons of the homogenic nature belong to either one or other of these classes. But, in reality, of course, these extreme developments are rare, and for the most part, the temperament in question is embodied in men and women of quite normal and unsensational exterior. Speaking of this subject and the connection between effeminateness and the homogenic nature in men, Dr. Moll says, quote, "It is, however, as well to point out at the outset that effeminacy does not by any means show itself in all earnings. Though one may find this or that indication in a great number of cases, yet it cannot be denied that a very large percentage, perhaps by far the majority of them, do not exhibit pronounced effeminacy." End quote. And it may be supposed that we may draw the same conclusion with regard to women of this class, namely, that the majority of them do not exhibit pronounced masculine habits. In fact, while these extreme cases are of the greatest value from a scientific point of view, as marking tendencies and limits of developments in certain directions, it would be a serious mistake to look upon them as representative cases of the whole phases of human evolution concerned. If now we come to what may be called the more normal type of the Uranian man, we find a man who, while possessing thoroughly masculine powers of mind and body, combines with them the tenderer and more emotional soul nature of the woman, and sometimes to a remarkable degree. Such men, as said, are often muscular and well-built, and not distinguishable in exterior structure and the carriage of body from others of their own sex. But emotionally they are extremely complex, tender, sensitive, pitiful, and loving, full of storm and stress, of ferment and fluctuation of the heart. The logical faculty may or may not in their case be well developed, but intuition is always strong. Like women, they read characters at a glance, and knowing, without knowing how, what is passing in the minds of others. For nursing and waiting on the needs of others they have often a peculiar gift. At the bottom lies the artist's nature, with the artist's sensibility and perception. Such an one is often a dreamer, of brooding, reserved habits, often a musician, or a man of culture, courted in society, which nevertheless does not understand him, though sometimes a child of the people, without any culture, but almost always with a peculiar inborn refinement. Dejoux, who speaks on the whole favorably of Uranian men and women, says of the former, quote, "They are enthusiastic for poetry and music, are often eminently skillful in the fine arts, and are overcome with emotion and sympathy at the least sad occurrence. Their sensitiveness, their endless tenderness for children, their love of flowers, their great pity for beggars and crippled folk, are truly womanly." End quote. And in another passage he indicates the artist's nature when he says, quote, "The nerve system of many a yearning is the finest and most complicated musical instrument in the service of the interior personality that can be imagined." End quote. It would seem probable that the attachment of such a one is of a tender and profound character. Indeed, it is possible that, in this class of men, we have the love sentiment in one of its most perfect forms, a form in which, from the necessities of the situation, the sensuous element, though present, is exquisitely subordinated to the spiritual. Says one writer on this subject, a Swiss, quote, "Happy indeed is that man who has won a real yearning for his friend. He walks on roses, without ever having to fear the thorns." End quote. And he adds, quote, "Can there be a more perfect sick nurse than a yearning?" End quote. And though these are ex parte utterances, we may believe there is an appreciable grain of truth in them. Another writer, quoted by Dejoux, speaks to somewhat the same effect, and may perhaps be received in a similar spirit. Quote, "We form," he says, "a peculiar aristocracy of modern spirits, of good and refined habit, and in many masculine circles are the representatives of the higher mental and artistic element. In us dreamers and enthusiasts lie the continual counterpoise to the sheer masculine portion of society, inclining, as it always does, to mere restless greed of gain and material, sensual pleasures." That men of this kind despise women, though a not uncommon belief, is one which hardly appears to be justified. Indeed, though naturally not inclined to fall in love in this direction, such men are by their nature drawn rather near to women, and it would seem that they often feel a singular appreciation and understanding of the emotional needs and destinies of the other sex, leading in many cases to a genuine though what is called platonic friendship. There is little doubt that they are often instinctively sought after by women, who, without suspecting the real cause, are conscious of a sympathetic chord in the homogenic, which they miss in the normal man. To quote Dejoux once more, "It would be a mistake to suppose that all Urnings must be woman-haters. Quite the contrary. They are not seldom the faithfulest friends, the truest allies, the most convinced defenders of women." To come now to the more normal and perfect specimens of the homogenic woman, we find a type in which the body is thoroughly feminine and gracious, with the roundure and fullness of the female form, and the continence and aptness of its movements, but in which the inner nature is to a great extent masculine, a temperament active, brave, originative, somewhat decisive, not too emotional, fond of outdoor life, of games and sports, of science, politics, or even business, good at organization and well pleased with positions of responsibility, sometimes indeed making an excellent and generous leader. Such a woman, it is easily seen from her special combination of qualities, is often fitted for remarkable work in professional life, or as manageress of institutions, or even as ruler of a country. Her love goes out to younger and more feminine natures than her own. It is a powerful passion, almost of a heroic type, and capable of inspiring to great deeds, and when held duly in leash may sometimes become an invaluable force in the teaching and training of girlhood, or in the creation of a school of thought or action among women. Many a Santa Clara or abbess founder of religious houses has probably been a woman of this type, and in all times such women, not being bound to men by the ordinary ties, have been able to work the more freely for the interests of their sex, a cause to which their own temperament impels them to devote themselves con amore. I have now sketched, very briefly and inadequately, it is true, both the extreme types and the more healthy types of the intermediate man and woman, types which may be verified from history and literature, though more certainly and satisfactorily, perhaps, from actual life around us. And unfamiliar though the subject is, it begins to appear that it is one which modern thought and science will have to face. Of the latter and more normal types, it may be said that they exist, and that they have always existed, in considerable abundance, and from that circumstance alone there is a strong probability that they have their place and purpose. As pointed out, there is no particular indication of morbidity about them, unless the special nature of their love sentiment be itself accounted morbid. And in the alienation of the sexes from each other, of which complaint is often made today, it must be admitted that they do much to fill the gap. The instinctive artistic nature of the male of this class, his sensitive spirit, his wave-like, emotional temperament, combined with hardihood of intellect and body, and the frank, free nature of the female, her masculine independence and strength wedded to thoroughly feminine grace of form and manner, may be said to give them both, through their double nature, command of life in all its phases, and a certain freemasonry of the secrets of the two sexes, which may well favor their function as reconcilers and interpreters. Certainly, it is remarkable that some of the world's greatest leaders and artists have been dowered either wholly or in part with the Uranian temperament, as in the cases of Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or among women, Christine of Sweden, Sappho the poetess, and others. End of chapter 2.